Hold on to your seats, folks, because this isn't your average courtroom drama. This is a story of audacity, corruption, and a takedown so swift it'll leave you breathless. And if you want to see more stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button. You don't want to miss what's coming next. Comment below where you are watching from. Karoline Leavitt, all of 27 years old and already the youngest White House press secretary in history, stepped into the courtroom. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, scanned the room, her demeanor radiating a quiet confidence that belied her age. She wasn't there for a press briefing. She was there to represent the Trump administration in a major corruption case, a battle against the insidious rot that can eat away at the heart of justice. Robert Mitchell, a wealthy developer with pockets as deep as his political connections, stood accused of funneling public funds into his own lavish projects. He wore a smug, self-assured smirk, confident that his wealth and influence would shield him. On the bench, Judge Edward Thornton observed Karoline with a chilling, calculating gaze. Leavitt was no stranger to pressure. The media and the political world had seen to it. But this was different. This was a fight for justice itself. Thornton wasn't just a tough judge. He was notorious for his sharp tongue and unpredictable rulings, a dangerous combination. Hours earlier, at the White House, Attorney General Pam Bondi had warned Leavitt, her voice laced with concern. "Thornton's got something shady about him, Karoline. Be careful, extremely careful." Leavitt approached the plaintiff's table, the weight of the thick stack of documents in her hands, a physical manifestation of the evidence she held. Fraudulent invoices, suspicious transactions, and a signature that sent a shiver of suspicion down her spine. The eyes of the jury, the reporters, and Mitchell, with his infuriating smirk, followed her every move. Then Thornton spoke, his voice deceptively calm, yet laced with a subtle condescension. "Miss Leavitt, I must ask, what is the White House's intent in sending someone so young here? This is a courtroom, not a press room." A beat of silence hung heavy in the air, punctuated only by a faint, almost imperceptible chuckle from Mitchell's defense attorney. It was a clear attempt to undermine her, to dismiss her based on her age. Thornton then continued, his deep, steady voice resonating with the authority and years of experience. "I trust you've come prepared to present before this court today. This is a place of law, and I expect you to bring grounded arguments." He tapped his hand lightly on the bench, his gaze fixed on her, a silent reminder of who controlled this courtroom. Leavitt nodded slightly, a subtle acknowledgement, her hand resting on the stack of documents, her fingers brushing the first page, a silent affirmation. "Your Honor," she replied, her voice clear and firm, cutting through the hushed murmurs that rippled through the back rows. "I'm here to present the truth. Robert Mitchell embezzled millions from public funds, and I have the evidence to prove it." She opened the file, pulling out a bank statement, a glaring red mark highlighting the damning transaction. "This is a financial record from Mitchell's company showing a $5 million transfer from public funds to a personal account, far exceeding the approved amount." Thornton's brow furrowed, his arms crossed over his chest, his calm demeanor masking a hint of skepticism. "Financial records," he said, his tone even, yet tinged with scrutiny, "are something this court has reviewed in many cases before. I expect you can clearly explain what these numbers mean, rather than simply displaying them." A small, smug laugh escaped the defense attorney, a middle-aged man in a perfectly tailored gray suit, his hair neatly combed. Mitchell sat beside him, hands clasped, the corner of his mouth twitching upward, as if he believed everything was still firmly under his control. Leavitt took a deep, steadying breath. She knew Thornton was testing her, subtly yet pointedly questioning her competence, her right to be there. "Your Honor," she continued, her voice rising slightly, gaining strength, "if I may, I'll explain. This $5 million transfer has no legitimate documentation to support it. Furthermore, we have witness testimony confirming Mitchell used those funds for personal gain." She held up the paper, her eyes locked on Thornton, a silent challenge in their depths. Thornton tilted his head, his eyes narrowing, as if weighing her words, measuring her resolve. "Witness testimony and documents," he said, his voice lowering, "are elements that require careful scrutiny for authenticity. I trust what you're presenting isn't mere speculation, Miss Leavitt." He tapped his hand lightly on the bench, his gaze sweeping the room, a subtle reinforcement of his control. "Proceed, but I expect clarity and focus." The tension in the courtroom thickened, palpable. A female juror in the front row, wearing a dark blue jacket, frowned at Thornton, as if sensing the veiled hostility in his tone. A reporter whispered to a colleague, "He's giving her a hard time." But Leavitt didn't falter. She set the bank statement down, pulling out a contract signed between Mitchell's company and the City Planning Commission. "Your Honor, this contract lists the project cost as $2 million, but the actual transfer was $5 million. This discrepancy isn't random. It's evidence of fraud." Thornton interrupted, his voice ringing with sternness, a clear warning. "Miss Leavitt, I must ask you to be cautious with such accusations. This court doesn't tolerate hasty conclusions. If you intend to argue fraud, I expect you to provide more concrete evidence." He tapped his gavel lightly on the bench, the small sound, a sharp reminder of his authority. "Present more, but I won't tolerate imprecision." Leavitt stood still, her gaze unwavering, her spine stiffening with resolve. She sensed Thornton was trying to maintain the upper hand, forcing her to prove every minute detail, to break her down. But she hadn't come here to back down. "Your Honor," she said, her voice sharp yet respectful, "I respect your demand for precision. So, I propose the court closely examine these documents, and if needed, I'm prepared to request an independent audit to verify them." Her words were a polite challenge, a gauntlet thrown down. Silence descended upon the courtroom. Mitchell's defense attorney frowned, the smug smile on his face beginning to fade, replaced by a flicker of unease. Thornton leaned forward, his hands on the bench, his eyes locked on Leavitt, a dangerous glint in their depths. "You're suggesting an independent audit in my courtroom?" he asked, his voice low, but carrying a clear warning. "I remind you, this is where I decide what's reviewed, Miss Leavitt. I expect you to understand your role in this process." He tapped his gavel again, his gaze unrelenting, as if trying to subdue her with his sheer presence. She stood tall, unflinching, her voice ringing with quiet authority. "Your Honor, I fully understand my role to ensure the truth is fully presented to this court. With your permission, I'll proceed with further evidence." She pushed the documents forward, her eyes fixed on Thornton, daring him to object. "May we continue?" The air in the courtroom grew heavy, thick with anticipation, like the calm before a storm. The white ceiling lights cast a stark glow on Karoline Leavitt's poised figure at the plaintiff's table. She stood there, hands resting lightly on the documents, her gaze unwavering, locked on Judge Edward Thornton. At the bench he sat upright, arms crossed over his black robe, his stern face etched with deep lines, the marks of decades wielding justice, a mask hiding who knows what. After Leavitt's final, bold request to proceed, Thornton spoke, his voice deep and steady, carrying the weight of his authority. "Miss Leavitt, I'll allow you to continue, but I expect you to present with the clarity and precision this courtroom demands." Leavitt nodded slightly, maintaining her professionalism, a steely glint in her eyes. "Your Honor, I deeply appreciate your guidance," she replied, her voice ringing with a confidence that drowned out the nervous murmurs from the back of the room. "I have no intention of presenting anything but the truth." She gave a faint smile, not to provoke, but to assert her control, to show him she wouldn't be intimidated. The female juror in the dark blue jacket shifted in her seat, her eyes darting from Thornton to Leavitt, as if weighing who truly held the upper hand in this tense exchange. Thornton tapped his hand lightly on the bench, his eyes narrowing, assessing her. "The truth is what this court always seeks," he said, his tone even, but edged with caution. "I've been in this position long enough to distinguish between grounded arguments and baseless accusations. Proceed." but I won't tolerate any conjecture." His tapping echoed steadily, like a drum beat, a constant reminder of his power in the room. Leavitt drew a deep breath, keeping her breathing even, controlled. She knew Thornton wasn't just controlling the courtroom. He was testing her, pushing her, forcing her to prove every detail under his strict, almost hostile scrutiny. She opened the file, pulling out a thicker subcontract, marked prominently in red ink. "Your Honor, I present this contract signed between Robert Mitchell's company and a non-existent contractor. This document conceals a $3 million transfer to his personal account." She held it up, her voice calm, but weighty with the significance of the evidence. "We have bank records confirming this transaction." The courtroom stirred, a ripple of unease spreading through the room. The female juror in blue leaned forward, her eyes widening in disbelief. Robert Mitchell, at the defendant's table, visibly clenched his hands. His confident smile, now a distorted, nervous grimace. His defense attorney, the man in the gray suit, stood abruptly. "Objection, Your Honor. This document hasn't been fully verified before this court." His voice was firm, but it lacked its usual certainty, as if he felt the rising pressure, the shifting tide of the proceedings. Thornton raised a hand, signaling the attorney to sit, his eyes never leaving Leavitt. "Miss Leavitt," he said, his voice lowering, laced with gravity, "this court demands all documents be clearly authenticated before consideration. I expect you can provide the lawful origin of this evidence, not just rely on numbers." He tapped his gavel lightly, the small sound reinforcing his authority. A threat hanging in the air. "Explain clearly if you can." Clearly, if Leavitt didn't waver. She set the contract down, pulling out a transaction statement, complete with a digital bank signature. "Your Honor, I respect your demand for authenticity. This is evidence legally obtained by the Justice Department, and I believe it addresses all your concerns." She held it up, her eyes fixed on Thornton, a challenge in their depths. "If I may ask, do you believe these documents need more time for review, or shall I proceed?" Thornton leaned forward, his hands on the bench, his sharp gaze piercing her, dissecting her. "Are you questioning my process, Miss Leavitt?" he asked, his voice low, but laced with a clear warning. "I remind you that all evidence presented in this court must meet strict legal standards. I won't accept any ambiguity in your arguments." He tapped his gavel again, his eyes sweeping the room, asserting his control, reminding everyone present who was in charge. Leavitt stood tall, her gaze unflinching. She sensed Thornton, trying to maintain the upper hand, to wear her down with his authority. But she hadn't come here to yield. "Your Honor, I fully understand the court's standards," she said, her voice sharp yet respectful, a carefully calibrated balance. "So, with your permission, I propose pausing the trial to have these documents fully verified. A step I believe will clarify the truth once and for all." Her proposal struck Thornton like an arrow, unexpected and sharp. He visibly leaned back in his chair, his breathing growing heavier, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Pause the trial?" Thornton repeated, his tone even, but tinged with doubt, a hint of disbelief. "You're requesting something unusual, Miss Leavitt. I remind you, this is a trial under my direction, and I will decide when a pause is warranted." He tapped his gavel lightly, his eyes fixed on her, measuring her reaction. "However, if you believe you have additional substantial evidence, I'll allow you to proceed, provided it's clear and convincing." The courtroom fell deathly silent, a silence so profound it was almost oppressive. A reporter in the back row stopped writing, his pen hovering over the paper, his eyes wide with anticipation. The female juror in the blue jacket clenched her hands, her eyes locked on Leavitt, waiting, breathless. Mitchell lifted his head, his anxious gaze darting to his attorney, who whispered something urgently, his expression tense, strained. Everyone could feel it. Something bigger was looming. The tension was a tangible thing, a weight pressing down on everyone in the room. Leavitt let the silence linger for a beat, a calculated pause, letting the weight of the moment settle. Then she reached down for another document, a call transcript marked confidential, obtained from the Justice Department. She didn't open it yet, just placed it on the table, her hand gently brushing the cover, a silent promise of what was to come. "Your Honor," she said, her voice low but piercing, cutting through the silence like a knife. "I deeply appreciate your patience. With your permission, I'll present another piece of evidence, one I believe will resolve any doubts you have about this case." Thornton sat upright, his hands resting on the oak bench, his narrowed eyes observing her with cold, calculating caution. The courtroom was so quiet that Robert Mitchell's rapid, shallow breathing from the defendant's table was clearly audible. Thornton finally spoke, his voice deep and steady, carrying the weight of his authority, a mask of composure barely concealing the turmoil beneath. "Miss Leavitt, I've allowed you to continue. I expect your next piece of evidence to meet this court's rigorous standards." Leavitt let the silence stretch for another second, her eyes never leaving his, a silent battle of wills. Then she reached to open the transcript, but a faint buzz from her coat pocket stopped her. She glanced down quickly, seeing a text flash on the screen. "Thornton directly involved. Check the signature on the subcontract. JJ." JJ was Jake, the investigative reporter she'd worked with before, a man with consistently reliable sources, a man she trusted implicitly. Her heart pounded in her chest. She took a deep breath, making a split-second decision, a gamble that could change everything. She set aside the recording for now and pursued this new, explosive lead. "Your Honor," she began, her voice calm but weighty, betraying none of the turmoil within her. "Before I present the transcript, I'd like to return to the subcontract I mentioned earlier." She pulled the document back from the table, flipping quickly to the last page, where a black ink signature stood out, bold and undeniable among the fine print. "This contract," she said, her voice clear, ringing with newfound certainty, "bears the approval signature of a senior official." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "And I'd like to ask you, Your Honor, do you recognize this signature?" She held up the document, her eyes locked on Thornton, a challenge, an accusation in their depths. He frowned, his hands gripping the edge of the bench for a fleeting second before relaxing, a subtle betrayal of his composure. Signature?" he replied, his tone even, but questioning, a hint of forced nonchalance. "Miss Leavitt, I don't make a habit of memorizing every stroke from the hundreds of documents that cross my desk. I expect you to provide a specific reason for me to consider this." His voice deepened, his gaze sweeping the room, as if to remind everyone, one last time, of his authority. Leavitt gave a faint smile, not to provoke, but to affirm, to show him she was on the right track, that she knew. "Your Honor, I deeply respect your caution," she said, her voice sharp yet reverent, a carefully crafted balance. "I believe you will recognize this signature because it's yours, Edward Thornton." She placed the document on the table, exposing the signature clearly for all to see. The courtroom erupted. Murmurs, gasps, the frantic scribbling of pens, the rustle of clothing as people shifted in their seats, a cacophony of disbelief and shock. A reporter in the back whispered, "What the hell?" before being pulled back by a colleague. The female juror in the blue jacket covered her mouth, her eyes shifting from surprise to suspicion, to a dawning understanding. Robert Mitchell snapped his head up, his face ashen, his panicked gaze darting to his attorney, who now leaned down to whisper something with a strained, desperate expression. But Thornton didn't react immediately. He sat still, frozen, his eyes glued to the document, his breathing growing heavier, shallower, as if the air had been sucked out of the room. "Miss Leavitt," he finally spoke, his voice low, but carrying a warning, a desperate attempt to regain control. "I must ask you to be cautious with such accusations. This court isn't a place for baseless conclusions. I expect you to prove the lawful origin of that document. He tapped his gavel lightly. The small sound pathetically weak, a far cry from its usual authoritative resonance. Leavitt didn't back down. She rested her hand on the table, her gaze steady, unwavering. Your Honor, I deeply appreciate your request, she said, her voice calm but cutting, each word precise and deliberate. This document was obtained by the Justice Department through a lawful subpoena. Your signature is on a transaction